I can tell you right away that some of you are going to be upset by this video. I know that for two reasons. One is what I'm going to tell you is different than what you've been told your whole life by healthcare providers, by doctors, by the internet, that you should keep your back really straight to bend. I know this is going to be different, and I know some people don't like that. And number two, I made a video showing you how to improve your forward bend. In other words, how to touch your toes better. And a lot of the comments in there were pretty outrageous. Like, how dare you tell me to bend my back? This is terrible for your discs. This is going to cause pain and injuries and blah, blah, blah. And so I realized that there was really a lot of misinformation out there and that this was a great educational opportunity. So my name is Rob Drenning. I'm a physical therapist. That's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to show you the science and the evidence behind what really does or doesn't happen to our back, to our spine when we bend to lift, and why I think you need to stop being so afraid to do that. But it's important to understand that there are exceptions to that. I'm not advocating for a free-for-all, just bend whenever you want. There are exceptions when we do want to be careful. So after I lay out the case for you why you should bend, I'm going to tell you when those rules don't apply and when we have to be careful and try not to bend our backs. So that's important too, so you can put together the whole picture and really have a great opinion for yourself so you can decide what's safe for you or what's not safe for you. Now, like I said, I'm going to lay out the science and the evidence for you with what happens at your back. If you're not the type of person that likes that type of education, then please stop watching now. Go find something else, because this won't be for you. But if you're not that, if you're the type of person that you like to know the why behind the what, you like to have a really informed and educated opinion, and you want to know what the science and the research is telling you, then you need to keep watching, because this video will be perfect for you. Okay, so why am I telling you it's okay and it's safe to bend your back when other people are telling you the opposite things and have been for your whole life? So let's get into the research of that right now. Two things to clear up first. One, when I say bending your back or flexing or flexion of the spine, those terms mean the same thing. Some studies use the terms interchangeably. I may hear as well, but just so you know, they mean the same thing. The second thing is what I'm going to share with you is a sample of some of the research that's been done out there. Okay, this stuff has been studied for decades. There is so much research on this stuff now that if I put everything in here, this video would be 2 hours long. So I picked a sample that's reflective of what the overall message from the research is telling us, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. You can do your own research, and I would really encourage you to do so on Google Scholar. You can find a lot of information yourself out there, but hopefully this will give you a great starting point. Let's look at this first study. This is one example of many that tell us that bending our back is maybe not the best thing. And what they found is that bending and twisting the trunk at work are risk factors for low back pain. But there's two things we have to consider with this study and others like it. One is that bending the trunk and back pain were correlated, or they were related. Okay, and that's very different than a cause and effect. Because they were related, we can't say that bending the trunk caused the back pain. We just know that they tend to happen together. I'll give you a real life example. Ice cream sales and murder rates are highly, highly correlated because they both happen in the summer months more often, right? But that doesn't mean if you go eat a double scoop of Rocky Road, it's going to turn you into some kind of psychopathic serial killer, right? That makes sense to us. But when we see studies like this with the back pain, our brains automatically want to go to, oh, well, bending the trunk is bad. We better not do that. It's going to cause back pain. But that's not true. That wouldn't be what this research is actually telling us. Just that there's a link. And the second and even more important thing is that this study and others like it don't actually measure flexion of the low back itself. They measured the trunk angle, which is your shoulders relative to your thighs. So the people in this study, they could be perfect hip hingers, keeping their spines really straight, or they could be really flexing their back. We wouldn't know. But again, we couldn't say that bending the low back itself was a risk factor for pain, just that bending the trunk at work might be. This next study actually did start to measure what was happening at the back, and what they found was that lifting load was a risk factor, but the spine flexion angle was not. So the actual bend in your back was not a risk factor for back pain in this study and some others like it, but the actual load that you were lifting was not. So it kind of supports what we were just saying, that maybe flexing the back is not the worst thing. But okay, so if flexing the spine and pain may or may not be a risk factor, what about if we avoid flexing when we lift? Will that prevent back pain, because that's what we're all really told, right? Proper lifting technique is if you keep your back straight, bend your knees. But do we know if that actually reduces our risk for back pain? Fortunately, now we do. This study is one example. They did a review of all the research that had been published on this, and they found that they could not support the squat technique as a means of preventing low back pain. When they pulled all the studies together, they couldn't support that doing the squat actually reduced the risk of back pain more than if you bended and lifted. This study found that there was insufficient evidence to recommend one technique over the other. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying that bending your back is better. I'm just saying that it's not worse. So we don't need to be so afraid to let that happen. This next review just a few years ago found that there was no consensus on the causality of spine postures and low back pain. We talked about correlation not being the same as cause, but when they looked at these lifting techniques and different spine angles, they couldn't find that any one was more likely to cause low back pain than the other. And that's really interesting because all of these findings are coming together, and it's sort of flying in the face of what we've been told our whole life, that we need to bend your knees and keep your back really straight. Maybe we don't need to be so afraid to do that. Now, this study had a really interesting finding. What they did was they looked at 3 postures when people were lifting. 1, they told people to bend their back as much as they could. 2, they told them to stay straight and extended as much as they could. And 3, they called a freestyle posture, which is just, hey, go lift however you want, do whatever you want to do. And they didn't measure back pain related with that, but what they did measure was the biomechanics, the things that were happening in the spine, the forces and things like that. And their findings were really interesting. They found that there was an increased demand on the muscles in the back, increased metabolic costs. In other words, it was less efficient because your muscles were having to work harder. And there was an increase in compression and shear forces happening in the joints at your back as well. Now, there's conflicting studies on that, whether you flex or extend to have more or less shear force. But this one was an interesting finding, and they actually recommended the freestyle or the flex technique because we know that it may not cause back pain any more than staying really straight, but it's actually a more efficient movement pattern, or it might be. So more things are starting to come out looking like that, and I'm not advocating to bend every time you lift. I'm just saying that it's not as dangerous as a lot of the messages are out there. This same study looked at actual spine angles that were happening in your back during those 3 movements. And what they found was pretty interesting. In the flexed posture, your back moved 41 degrees of flexion. Now, there's probably 50 degrees of max flexion in your back, give or take. So when you were told to bend as much as you can and lift, you're using about 80% of your range. And in the freestyle technique, the do whatever you want group, they bent through 38 degrees of motion. So almost the same as the max flexion people. And here's the cool part. In the group that was extended, they still went through 30 degrees or 60+% of the full flexion available. So their back was still flexing. And this brings up another interesting point, is that maybe we can't actually control the bend in our back as much as we'd like to think we could. It would make sense why all 3 postures don't really affect your likelihood for back pain, because maybe even when you think you're straight, we're really not. The study in 2018 actually looked at trained weightlifters, people who have been trying to keep their back straight for years and are really good with their technique. And what they found was during squats and deadlift, they were still going through 60 to 75% of their maximum flexion. They're trying to keep their back straight, but it's still bending. They can't control it. That's really interesting. We need to think about that when we're doing some of these lifts and when we're relaying the messages to people. So let's summarize this real quick. 1, flexion or bending is not an independent risk factor for low back pain. There is no evidence to support it, and there is no evidence saying that if you flex your back, it's going to cause a disc or a back injury more often than if you don't flex your back. And lifting with one posture or another hasn't really been shown to tease that out either. Whether you bend and lift, whether you're straight and lift, your likelihood of back pain is the same. And now we know we can't actually control it as much as we think we can anyway. So the other type of research out there, so what we just talked about was studies done in real life situations, the lifting postures, the incidence of back pain over time. But the other school of thought was done by the biomechanics research. And this is where more information on bending your back is bad comes out. As what they did is they used dead animal discs and they flexed and loaded them repeatedly, and then they measured what happened. This study is one example. There are many like it, that when you flex and compress your back, it leads to disc injuries when you do it over and over and over again. Okay, we know that, so our brains automatically went to, oh, flexing your discs is bad, we better not do that. But that's a huge leap, and now we're going to talk about why. This study is here because it's an example of someone that measured, well, what if we just compress it in the neutral range, right? What if we don't do a lot of flexing or bending? And you know what they found? The discs still got hurt, just in a different place. So it might just be the load matching up with some of those other studies that we talked about. The load could cause the disc injuries. Maybe it's not the actual flexion itself. This study found that after 86,000 cycles of flexion and compression, 20% of discs herniated, and that when you increase the amount of compression, that percentage went up. And their thinking was that if you did more and more reps, that percentage would go up again. So the thought was that maybe there's a shelf life on your disc, right? If you flex it, you'll be fine until you reach that limit, and then your disc is just done. But what did we just learn from some of those other research? Can we control how much we bend our back? No, probably not as well as we think we can. So that means, how many times a day do you think your back bends? How many times do you think you flex? Hundreds or 1,000, a lot of times. If this study were true in our live human discs, we'd all be screwed. We'd all have herniated discs by the time we were 5 years old, because we would do 86,000, 100,000 flexion cycles very quickly because we bend our back a lot. But we know this isn't true. We don't all have herniated discs or disc injuries. So this study started looking at live discs and things that happen to a living tissue. And you know what they found? That when they repeatedly flexed the disc, but then allowed it to rest, the disc positively adapted. It got stronger. Your discs can get stronger. This makes sense to us with our muscles, right? We lift weights, we exercise, and then we rest. And what happens? Our muscles repair and get bigger and get stronger. If you kept lifting every day and never stopped, yeah, they would get damaged over time. But that's not how we do things. And our discs are the same way. It's not wear and tear. This study is an excellent example. There are others like it, that it's more wear and repair, that your discs can get stronger. And what we see is, okay, maybe, it takes more than that, or it's still a shelf life in a human disc as well, but it just takes a little bit longer. Okay, we're never doing 86,000 cycles of flexion in our daily lives in a row. Nobody ever would do that. We're always getting rest with our discs. Even though we bend a lot during the day, we're always getting rest. We sit, we're not moving. We are watching TV, we're not moving. We sleep at night. That's rest for your discs. There's always rest periods, even though we bend a lot. So our discs can get stronger. We just have to not be afraid to allow them to do that. But like I just alluded to, some people will say, well, it might just take longer in a living disc. So this study is a great example. They looked at athletes with a lot of flexion forces and a lot of extension forces. And they measured them over years and over the long term. So people who have done hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cycles of these movements, and their incidence of back pain was the same. It didn't matter where they were in a flexed or bent dominant sport or the opposite. It was all the same. So what's the real take-home message here? Am I just saying we should not care at all and flex and bend your back all the time? No, of course not. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying we need to be more of a movement optimist. Okay? If you have avoided bending for your whole life, and then you watch this video and then you just go start lifting heavy things and letting your back bend, guess what? You're probably going to get hurt because you haven't given your disc time to be loaded, to be flexed, and then to rest. You haven't given it time to strengthen. So that would be an instance where I think you should not go out and start lifting with a flexed spine. But you do need to gradually reintroduce that force and allow your back to bend, allow it to get stronger, so that over the long term, then you can start to add lifting and other movements when your back is bent if you need to. Because sometimes in life we have to do that. If there's things in the trunk of the car, you can't keep your back upright. If you have to reach in a crib, guess what? You got to flex your back. So we have to teach our back to tolerate those real life scenarios so that we're prepared for that. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So when else should we avoid bending the back? I talked about that in the very beginning. There are some exceptions. One, we just talked about if you've never done it, gradually do it. Two, if you currently have back pain and it feels better to not flex your spine, then don't do it. Stay extended. Do that to modify symptoms. That is perfectly fine and common sense, right? But the take-home message would be just do that in the short term. You don't have to do that for the rest of your life. Once your back feels better, gradually reintroduce that bend, allow your discs to strengthen again. If you don't do that, back pain will recur, and it does for so many of us because we fear that movement a little bit too much. Another example of when we should avoid bending the back a lot is when your sport specifically requires that. In lifting, an example would be the snatch lifts or the clean and jerk, the more fast-moving lifts. You need your back and your core to be really solid and still so that your hips and arms can be doing more of the movements and you can get yourself in the right position. Versus just a regular squat, it's slower and more controlled. You're going to see a lot more bend, and you can see that in the athletes who are doing that as well. So if it's a sport-specific thing, then you want to train yourself to that specification and try to keep your back as straight as you can. You might not be able to, we just found that out, but nonetheless, it's still good to try. And the third thing, and this is just where it kind of is my opinion, if you're lifting very heavy things and you're at end range, most of us don't do that very often or often enough to condition our backs to tolerate that amount of compressive load. I don't know that you're more likely to get hurt if you let yourself bend to the end range and lift something very heavy, or if you try to keep it straight. We don't know that. But sort of in my head, it just seems like a why not type of thing. If you can keep your back straight, engage those muscles a lot more, it just might be a safer way to lift very heavy things at a very end range position. Unless you specifically condition yourself to do that, which I think most of us don't do. So now I want to know what you think. You heard this message. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. And now we need to go watch this video about how to touch your toes and how to improve that forward bend to allow those discs to get stronger.